King Leopold II. King Leopold II managed to control a territory roughly 80 times the size of Belgium without making it a Belgian colony. From 1885, the Congo Free State was ruled by Leopold personally as its sovereign, and European powers had recognized the new state after he presented his project as humanitarian and commercial. In practice, it became a vast system for extracting wealth. The most profitable resource eventually became wild rubber. As global demand exploded in the 1890s, Congolese communities were forced to collect it. Companies and state agents imposed quotas, while the force publique, an armed colonial force, helped enforce the system. Hostages could be taken, villages attacked or burned, and people subjected to imprisonment, beatings, killings, and mutilation. The severed hand became the most infamous symbol of Leopold's Congo. Soldiers were expected to account for ammunition used in the field, and hands could serve as evidence that bullets had not simply been wasted. But mutilation also became part of the wider machinery of terror. Photographs and eyewitness testimony eventually helped make these abuses impossible to dismiss, and the catastrophe went far beyond people directly killed by colonial forces. Forced labor disrupted farming and communities. Violence drove people from their homes. Famine, disease, and falling birth rates added to the population collapse. This is why the famous claim that Leopold killed 10 million people needs caution. There was no reliable census, and historians cannot establish an exact death toll. Modern assessments range from hundreds of thousands of excess deaths and demographic losses to several million. International investigations eventually confirmed serious abuses. Under growing pressure, Leopold surrendered the Congo Free State in 1908 when Belgium annexed it as a colony. The system had become so notorious that Leopold lost the private empire he had spent decades building. Shiro Ishii, Unit 731. Shiro Ishii was a Japanese army doctor, but the facility he commanded in occupied Manchuria was not an ordinary military laboratory. Unit 731 was the center of Japan's biological warfare program, built near Harbin and disguised as an epidemic prevention and water purification department. At its height, the complex had thousands of personnel and was capable of holding hundreds of prisoners for experiments. Those prisoners became human test subjects. Most were Chinese civilians and prisoners, although other nationalities were also victimized. Researchers deliberately infected people with diseases including plague, cholera, and anthrax, studying how infections progressed and testing ways to turn pathogens into weapons. Prisoners were also exposed to experimental bombs designed to spread infectious material. Thousands were killed in the experiments at Unit 731 and related facilities, although historians cannot establish a precise total. But Ishii's program didn't remain inside the laboratory. Japanese forces actually deployed biological weapons in China. Plague-infected fleas were dispersed in attacks on Chinese communities, while other operations involved pathogens such as anthrax and glanders. In other words, Unit 731 wasn't simply researching whether biological warfare could work, it helped put it into practice. Then Japan surrendered in 1945, and the story took an extraordinary turn. American investigators wanted the results of Ishii's experiments. U.S. National Archives records confirm that occupation authorities and experts from Fort Detrick investigated Ishii and his biological warfare research. Instead of facing a major American war crimes prosecution, Ishii and key associates received protection from prosecution as U.S. officials sought access to the research data. Ishii died in Japan in 1959. The man who had directed one of World War II's most notorious programs of lethal human experimentation was never tried for those crimes. Hissène Habré. Hissène Habré ruled Chad for only 8 years, but decades later, investigators found something extraordinary inside the abandoned headquarters of his secret police. Rooms filled with the regime's own records. The documents contained prisoner lists, interrogation reports, surveillance files, and records of deaths in detention. They helped expose how organized the violence under Habré had been. Habré seized power in 1982 and built a one-party dictatorship. At its center was the Documentation and Security Directorate, or DDS, a political police force that reported directly to him. Opponents were arrested and tortured, while entire ethnic groups, including the Hajarai and Zagawa, were targeted when the government considered their leaders a threat. The surviving paperwork gives the story a disturbing level level of detail. Researchers identified 12,321 victims of detention, torture, and other abuses in DDS files, including 1,208 people recorded as killed or having died in detention. A Chadian Truth Commission later estimated that Habré's government was responsible for more than 40,000 deaths, although that figure cannot be independently confirmed. Habré was overthrown in 1990 and fled to Senegal. For years, victims and human rights groups pursued him through courts in Senegal and abroad. Eventually, a special African-backed court was created inside Senegal's judicial system, and his trial opened in Dakar in 2015. In May 2016, the court convicted the former president of crimes including torture, cruel treatment, rape, and war crimes, and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The verdict was historic. A former African ruler had been prosecuted in another African country under universal jurisdiction. Habré had escaped Chad with his regime gone, but more than 2 decades later, survivors helped bring him into a courtroom. Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer made money from one of Victorian Britain's darkest businesses, taking unwanted babies from desperate mothers. In the 19th century, women known as baby farmers accepted infants in exchange for payment, supposedly to raise them or arrange adoption. Dyer discovered that there was a much cheaper way to run the business: take the money and get rid of the child. She operated for years, moving between towns and using different names. But in 1896, one small mistake began to unravel everything. A package was pulled from the River Thames near Reading. Inside was the body of an infant girl. The child had been strangled, but the most important clue was the brown paper wrapped around her. Investigators traced markings on it back to Dyer's address. Police began watching her home and eventually arrested her on April 4th. Then the Thames revealed more. 7 infant bodies were ultimately recovered from the river in connection with the investigation. 2 babies, Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons, were discovered together inside a carpet bag. Investigators had uncovered something far larger than a single murder. Dyer had spent years taking children into her care, and authorities suspected that many more had died. But this is where modern retellings often become unreliable. Estimates claiming she murdered 200, 300, or even 400 babies cannot be established from surviving evidence. Reading Museum itself notes that the true number murdered may never be known. Dyer was prosecuted for the murder of Doris Marmon, convicted at the Old Bailey, and sentenced to death. She was executed in 1896. The disturbing part is not only how she was finally caught, it is how long the system allowed someone to repeatedly accept vulnerable infants for money before a piece of wrapping paper floating with a body helped lead police back to her. Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile spent decades becoming one of Britain's most recognizable television personalities. He hosted BBC programs, raised large sums for charity, and gained extraordinary access to hospitals and vulnerable people. But after his death in 2011, investigators concluded that this public image had concealed a pattern of sexual abuse stretching across roughly 6 decades. The scale only became clear after allegations surfaced publicly in 2012. Police and the NSPCC eventually recorded 214 criminal offenses attributed to Savile. The earliest recorded offense dated to 1955, and the latest to 2009. 73% of the victims in that investigation were under 18. Most were girls or women, and the youngest recorded victim was 8 years old. The reported offenses included 34 rapes or penetration offenses. What made the case especially disturbing was where Savile could operate. Allegations were connected not only to BBC premises, but to hospitals around Britain. The NHS eventually published 44 investigation reports covering institutions associated with him, including Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville, and Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital. At Broadmoor, the problem went beyond simply allowing a celebrity to visit. Savile developed an unusually powerful role there. In 1988, he became involved in a task force overseeing the hospital, and a later government investigation concluded that inadequate procedures had allowed him into a position of authority that he used to abuse victims. Savile died before the allegations became a national scandal, so he never faced a criminal trial over them. Instead, the investigations exposed how celebrities, fundraising, and poorly controlled access had allowed him to move through institutions containing vulnerable people. One official review summarized the central failure starkly: Savile had been hiding in plain sight. Gao Chengyong. For 28 years, police in China were hunting a serial killer without knowing that he was still living in the same region where many of the murders had occurred. His name was Gao Chengyong, and between 1988 and 2002, Chinese courts found that he murdered 11 women and girls in Baiyin and Baotou. Gao typically followed victims and attacked them after gaining access to places where they were alone. The crimes involved robbery, rape, and murder, and several victims' bodies were mutilated afterward. His youngest victim was only 8 years old. The brutality of the murders eventually earned the unidentified killer comparisons in the media to Jack the Ripper. Police knew they were dealing with a serial offender, but identifying him was another problem. In 2004, China's Ministry of Public Security made the case a priority investigation. Years passed without an arrest. Gao stopped killing after 2002, and the trail appeared to go cold. Then forensic technology changed the investigation. Police eventually used Y chromosome DNA testing, which can reveal genetic relationships through the male family line. Authorities obtained a DNA sample from one of Gao's relatives during a separate investigation and found that it indicated a close familial connection to the unknown killer. That gave investigators the family they needed to examine. They eventually identified Gao and matched him to the case. On August 26, 2016, police arrested him, almost 3 decades after the first murder. The man investigators had spent years searching for was working at a small shop in Baiyin. In March 2018, Gao was convicted of robbery, intentional homicide, rape, and desecration of corpses, and sentenced to death. He did not appeal. China's Supreme People's Court later approved the sentence, and on January 3, 2019, Gao Chengyong was executed. A murder investigation that had remained unsolved for decades was ultimately cracked not because Gao committed another crime, but because DNA pointed investigators toward his family. John R. Brinkley. John R. Brinkley built a medical fortune around an operation that sounds like satire. He implanted pieces of goat testicles into men and claimed the procedure could restore sexual vitality. There was no good scientific basis for it. Yet during the 1920s, patients traveled to his hospital in Milford, Kansas, and paid enormous sums for the treatment. Brinkley's real genius wasn't medicine, it was marketing. In 1923, he launched his own radio station, KFKB. Between music, news, and entertainment, Brinkley promoted his operations, broadcast patient testimonials, and even diagnosed listeners from letters. 3 times a day, he recommended numbered prescriptions that could be purchased through participating pharmacies. Radio had given a questionable doctor something previous medical fraudsters could barely imagine: direct access to potential patients across multiple states. Eventually, regulators caught up. In 1930, the Kansas Medical Board revoked Brinkley's license for unprofessional conduct, while federal regulators refused to renew his radio license. But Brinkley didn't disappear. He moved to Del Rio, Texas, and established a powerful station just across the Mexican border, allowing his broadcasts to reach American listeners again. His medical businesses continued making him wealthy. Then one of his biggest enemies, medical editor Morris Fishbein, publicly attacked him as a quack. Brinkley responded by suing Fishbein for libel. That decision backfired spectacularly. During the case, Brinkley's medical claims came under scrutiny, and the jury sided with Fishbein. An appellate court later concluded that Brinkley's methods violated acceptable medical ethics, and that he could properly be considered a charlatan and quack. The defeat was followed by malpractice claims and mounting financial problems. By 1941, the man who had once earned a fortune selling miracle medicine was bankrupt. He died the following year. James Arthur Ray. James Arthur Ray had become a self-help superstar. He appeared in The Secret, promoted ideas about achieving wealth and personal transformation, and charged thousands of dollars for intensive retreats. Then, in October 2009, one of those retreats ended with 3 people dead. The 5-day event near Sedona, Arizona was called Spiritual Warrior. Participants paid more than $9,000 each. Its final exercise was Ray's version of a sweat lodge ceremony. More than 50 people crowded inside a low, makeshift structure covered with tarps and blankets, while heated rocks were brought inside. The ceremony lasted roughly 2 hours, and people began collapsing. According to prosecutors at Ray's later trial, participants showed signs of severe distress. Some were dragged outside, and Ray continued the ceremony while conditions became increasingly dangerous. Kirby Brown and James Shore died that day. Liz Newman fell into a coma and died 9 days later. 18 other participants were injured. This wasn't simply a retreat where an unpredictable accident occurred. Prosecutors argued that Ray had pushed the heat to dangerous levels and failed to respond adequately as participants became overwhelmed. In 2011, a jury rejected the more serious manslaughter charges, but convicted him of 3 counts of negligent homicide. Ray was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was released in 2013 and then did something that might be the strangest part of the story. He eventually returned to the self-help industry. Years later, he was again offering coaching, speaking publicly, and selling private sessions. James Arthur Ray died in 2025 at age 67. His career had once been built around teaching people how to transform their lives, but the event that ultimately defined him was one where 3 people seeking that transformation never came home.